3 days before my 21st birthday, my stepfather sat me down at the kitchen table and told me, very calmly, that the family bookstore my grandmother built from nothing was finally going to be sold, and that all I needed to do was sign one form to make it official. What he didn't know was that my grandmother had spent the last 4 years of her life making sure that form would never actually work. My name is Claire Bennett. This is what happened when my family tried to sell something that was never theirs to sell. My grandmother, Margaret Bennett, opened Ashcroft Books on a corner lot in downtown Millhaven 42 years ago. With a loan, she'd talked a skeptical bank manager into giving a 25-year-old woman with no collateral except a folder of hand-drawn floor plans and, according to family legend, sheer force of will. She ran that store through 3 recessions, a burst water pipe that ruined half her inventory in her 30s, and, in her own words, more bad landlords than I care to remember, until she finally bought the building outright when she turned 52. By the time I was old enough to work the register, Ashcroft Books wasn't just a store to the people of Millhaven. It was the only place in town that still hosted a Thursday night poetry reading, the only place that let local kids read for free in the back corner as long as they kept their voices down, the only place that smelled, permanently and wonderfully, like old paper, and the cinnamon coffee grandma insisted on brewing every single morning at exactly 7:15. I started working there when I was 13, officially helping, which mostly meant reshelving picture books and eating more free shortbread than any one person reasonably should. By 16, I was doing real inventory work, learning the supplier accounts, sitting in on grandma's calls with distributors. By 19, I was managing the weekend shifts entirely on my own, and Grandma had started, without ever quite announcing it out loud, treating me less like a granddaughter who helped out on weekends and more like someone she was quietly, deliberately training. My mother, Susan, had a more complicated relationship with the store than I did. She'd grown up watching Margaret pour nearly every spare hour into it, and I think some part of her had always resented coming in second place to a building full of books and a mother who measured love in shelf space and store hours rather than time at home. Susan left Millhaven for college the day she turned 18 and didn't come back except for holidays, married my father, and after he passed away suddenly when I was 6, eventually remarried a man named Victor Holt, who ran a mid-sized property development consulting firm 2 towns over. Victor was perfectly pleasant at family dinners and utterly uninterested in anything that didn't eventually show up as a line item on a spreadsheet. He referred to Ashcroft Books, more than once, within my hearing, as your mother's little sentimental project that happens to sit on an increasingly valuable corner lot. He wasn't wrong about the lot, unfortunately. Downtown Millhaven had been quietly gentrifying for the better part of a decade by the time I was in my late teens, and the corner where the store sat, 2 blocks from the newly renovated courthouse annex and directly across from a popular weekend farmers market, had become exactly the kind of real estate that developers circled the way gulls circle a dropped sandwich on a boardwalk. Victor mentioned, casually, at more than one family dinner over the years, that someone really ought to sit Margaret down and talk about what that property's actually worth now, for everyone's sake. Grandma always changed the subject, usually by asking Victor a pointed question about his own business that somehow always ended the conversation faster than he'd started it. I didn't understand, at the time, that she was already several careful steps ahead of him. Grandma was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the winter I turned 18. She fought it for nearly 2 years with the same stubbornness she'd used to fight off at least 3 different developers who tried to buy her out over the decades. But by the time I turned 20, the fight had mostly shifted from cure to comfort. I spent nearly every afternoon that final summer sitting with her in the cramped back office of the store, going through invoices and old supplier contacts, not because she genuinely needed the help anymore, but because I think we both understood, without ever quite saying it aloud, that she was making absolutely sure I knew everything the store would need in order to survive without her. One afternoon in late June, about 7 weeks before she died, she set down the ledger we'd been quietly reviewing and looked at me for a long, deliberate moment. The kind of look she usually saved for difficult customers who needed to understand she was serious. "Claire," she said, "I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it this time, not just nod along the way you do when you think I'm being dramatic about something." I told her I was listening. "Your mother loves you," she said, genuinely in her own way. "But Victor has been asking her, for going on 3 years now, what this building is worth, and your mother has started quietly wondering the same thing, even if she'd never admit that out loud to either of us. When I'm gone, they are going to want to sell this store, quickly and quietly, and they are going to want you to simply go along with it, because you're young, because they'll frame it as being practical, and because it will be easier for everyone if you don't put up a fight." I remember telling her that wasn't going to happen, that Mom wouldn't actually do that to her. Grandma just held my hand, her grip still surprisingly firm even then, and said, "I've already made sure it doesn't matter what anyone wants to do about it. I just need you to trust me on this, and I need you to be patient, because the way I've arranged everything, it only works if you're patient and you don't panic when things get difficult." I didn't fully understand what she meant until nearly 2 years later. Margaret Bennett died on September 9th, 5 days after my 21st birthday. The funeral was held at Holy Trinity, the small stone church 2 streets from the store, and what felt like half of Millhaven showed up, including at least a dozen people who told me, through tears, about a free book Margaret had once quietly slipped them during a hard year, or a poetry reading that had changed how they saw themselves at exactly the right moment. My mother cried through most of the service. Victor wore an appropriately somber charcoal suit and checked his phone twice during the eulogy, which I noticed and chose, at the time, not to mention to anyone. The will was read 2.5 weeks later in a small conference room at Rays and Holloway, the law firm Margaret had quietly used for decades. I expected something simple: the store passing to my mother, maybe some modest savings split evenly between us. Instead, the estate attorney, a measured, careful man named Daniel Rays, explained that the store building, the business itself, and an associated operating account had all been transferred 4 years earlier into something called the Bennett Family Legacy Trust, an irrevocable trust with exactly one named beneficiary. Me. My mother's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, and then something considerably sharper. "That can't possibly be right," she said. "I'm her only daughter." Daniel Rays, in the calm, unbothered tone I imagine estate attorneys develop after decades of delivering exactly this kind of news to exactly this kind of shocked family, explained that Margaret had structured the trust specifically so that the store would pass directly to me upon her death, bypassing probate entirely, with the express written condition that the building could not be sold, leased to any third party, or substantially altered for a period of 10 years from the date of her death, except under narrow hardship conditions reviewed by the trust's appointed co-trustee, which was Rays and Holloway's firm itself, acting jointly with me. My mother asked, very quietly, why Margaret hadn't told her any of this while she was still alive. Daniel Rays's answer stayed with me for a long time afterward. "Your mother's exact words to me, Mrs. Holt, when we drew this document up together, were that she loved you very much, but that she'd watched you mention the property's value one too many times over the years to feel confident the store would still be standing 5 years after she was gone, if it passed through you and Victor first." Victor, seated beside my mother, went very still and said absolutely nothing. For the first year after Grandma died, things stayed, if not exactly warm, at least reasonably civil. I ran the store precisely the way she'd trained me to, kept the Thursday poetry nights going without interruption, kept the free reading corner fully stocked for the neighborhood kids. My mother would stop by occasionally, sometimes staying to help rearrange a window display, sometimes just sitting quietly in Grandma's old chair in the back office for a while before leaving without saying very much at all. I think, in her own complicated and guarded way, she was still grieving. Victor, on the other hand, began what I now recognize clearly as a slow, deliberate, and remarkably patient campaign. It started small, a passing comment at Thanksgiving about how sentimental attachment to a building isn't really a sound business strategy for a young woman building her future. A mention, a few months after that the property taxes alone were an unreasonable burden to leave on someone so young. By the following spring, he'd stopped bothering with subtlety altogether. He started bringing printed market comparables to family dinners, showing my mother exactly what similar corner lots downtown had recently sold for. He talked, often and at length, about building real generational wealth and not letting emotional attachment get in the way of Claire's actual long-term financial future. As though selling the one thing my grandmother had spent her entire adult life protecting was somehow a generous gift he was trying, against my own stubbornness, to give me. I said no every single time, calmly, the exact way Grandma had once taught me to handle a difficult customer who wouldn't take a reasonable answer. Every time, Victor would nod slowly, say something like, "Just something worth thinking about," and let it drop for a few weeks before inevitably bringing it back up again in some new, slightly repackaged form. What I didn't know, until much later, was that Victor had done considerably more than simply talk about it at dinner. In April, nearly 3 years after Grandma's death, I got a call from Daniel Reyes's office asking me to come in as soon as I could. When I arrived, Daniel's expression was more serious than I'd seen it before. He explained that his office had just been contacted by the county clerk's office regarding a filing that had been submitted the previous week. A notice of default and intent to foreclose on the Ashcroft Books property, filed by a lending entity called Meridian Capital Holdings, citing an unpaid loan allegedly secured against the building nearly 6 years earlier, supposedly signed by my grandmother. I stared at the paperwork Daniel slid across his desk. "Grandma never took out a loan against this building," I said. "She paid it off outright when I was a kid. She talked about it constantly. She was proud of it." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what the trust records show as well, which means this signature," he tapped the notarized loan document included in the filing, "is either an extraordinary coincidence or it was fabricated." He explained that his office had already begun comparing the signature and notary stamp against Margaret's authenticated signature on file with the trust, along with the state notary registry. Within 2 days, the notary commission number listed on the loan document came back to a notary public who had retired and passed away 4 years before the document's supposed signing date. I sat in that office for a long, silent moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest. Someone hadn't just been quietly angling to convince me to sell. Someone had manufactured a fraudulent debt against a building that had been fully, legitimately paid off for over a decade, specifically to force a foreclosure sale that would bypass the trust entirely. Daniel explained, patiently and carefully, that his office had immediately filed an emergency motion to halt the foreclosure proceeding, citing the trust's clean chain of title and the fabricated notary commission as clear evidence of fraud. He also explained something I hadn't fully grasped before that moment. Because the trust was irrevocable and the 10-year no-sale clause was completely airtight, even a legitimate offer, let alone a fraudulent foreclosure, could not legally proceed under any circumstances until the restriction period ended, 7 more years from now, and even then, only with my explicit written consent as sole beneficiary. "Whoever filed this can pursue whatever scheme they want," Daniel told me. "Nothing moves without your signature, and nothing moves at all until that restriction lifts on its own. I wanted you to see this today because I genuinely think you deserve to know what's happening around you, not just what's eventually going to happen to you." I drove home that afternoon feeling something I can only describe as quietly, thoroughly furious, the kind of anger that doesn't shout or slam doors, just settles into your chest and simply stays there, humming. I didn't confront Victor immediately. I wanted to understand exactly what I was actually dealing with first. Over the following several weeks, I asked Daniel to walk me through the entire trust document line by line, every clause, every protection Grandma had carefully built into it years in advance. I learned that she hadn't just blocked any potential sale for a full decade. She'd also specifically required that any suspicious filing or unauthorized claim against the property be formally documented and disclosed to me in writing, precisely, Daniel said, because she strongly suspected someone might eventually try exactly what happened here. Grandma hadn't simply protected the store in a general sense. She had specifically anticipated a scheme like this, nearly 4 years before anyone ever attempted it. I confronted Victor on a quiet Sunday evening at my mother's house, with my mother present in the room, because I wanted her to hear this directly from me, rather than through whatever carefully filtered version Victor would inevitably deliver to her later, alone. I placed the folder Daniel had given me down on the kitchen table, the same kind of table, coincidentally, where Grandma used to sit with me for hours over old ledgers. "I know about Meridian Capital," I said. "I know a loan document surfaced with Grandma's supposed signature on it, 6 years after she paid this building off in full, notarized by a man who died 4 years before that document was supposedly signed." Victor's face did the particular thing I imagine faces do when someone realizes a door they'd assumed was still locked had actually just been quietly closed on them. He recovered quickly, though in the same smooth, unbothered way he tended to recover from most inconvenient things in life. "I don't know anything about a loan document," he said. "Someone's clearly trying to scam an old family business. I think you'd want my help looking into it, not accusing me." "It was never your job to explore anything on my behalf," I said. "You don't have any legal relationship to that property at all, not even a distant one. Someone forged Grandma's signature and a dead notary's stamp on a fraudulent loan document, specifically to create a foreclosure that could bypass the trust entirely." My mother's voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet in a way I honestly hadn't heard from her before. "Victor, is that actually true?" He didn't answer her directly, not at first. Instead, he turned back toward me. "The trust restriction runs out eventually, Claire. In 7 years, that clause lifts entirely, and frankly, holding onto a modestly struggling little bookstore purely out of sentiment isn't going to feel like a particularly smart decision when you're 28 and start realizing what a corner lot like this is actually worth on the open market." "It's not struggling," I said. "It's turned a profit every single year since Grandma opened its doors, including through 2 full recessions and 1 burst pipe. I have the books, Victor. I've read every single one of them cover to cover more times than you've probably read a single financial report about the place. That building is a liability wearing a very convincing coat of nostalgia," he said, his earlier pleasantness finally cracking around the edges. "Your grandmother built a very comfortable trap for you, and you're simply too attached to it to see that clearly." "She built a trap for you," I said. "That's the part you still don't seem to understand. She knew exactly what someone might eventually try 4 years before anyone tried it. Every single protection written into that trust exists because she anticipated exactly this." My mother sat very still through most of this exchange, and when she finally spoke again, she didn't rush to defend him. "Victor," she said, "if you had nothing to do with this, why does this feel like the first time you've actually seemed worried instead of annoyed?" I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because I know some of you have lived some version of watching someone try to talk you out of protecting something that genuinely matters to you, all dressed up as concern for your own good. If that's you, type, "I understand" in the comments, because I promise you, I understand it more than you probably know. Now, back to the story, because what happened over the following year is the part that genuinely surprised even me. The fraud investigation moved forward quietly over the following months. Daniel's office worked with the county recorder and, eventually, the district attorney's financial crimes unit to trace the paperwork trail behind Meridian Capital Holdings. What they found was that the entity had been registered only 8 months earlier, with a business address that turned out to be a mailbox rental store 2 towns over, the same town where Victor's consulting firm was based. I watched, over those months, as my mother grew visibly more distant on the phone, more tired sounding, clearly caught between a daughter she loved and a husband whose explanations had apparently become harder and harder for her to fully believe. The situation finally came to a head when Daniel called me again, this time with something conclusive. The forensic document examiner retained by the district attorney's office had matched a partial fingerprint recovered from the notarized loan document to a set of prints on file from an unrelated business licensing application Victor had submitted years earlier for his consulting firm. I remember sitting in Daniel's office reading through the forensic report, my hands genuinely shaking, not exactly from fear, but from the specific, deeply personal cruelty of what it confirmed. That Victor hadn't simply hoped I'd eventually give in and sell. He had manufactured a fraudulent debt against my grandmother's legacy, forged her signature after she was no longer alive to defend herself, and gambled that no one would look closely enough to notice. Daniel, for the first time since I'd known him, looked something close to genuinely angry on my behalf. "This is no longer a civil dispute," he told me firmly. "This is a criminal referral. The DA's office will be pursuing forgery and attempted fraud charges." It took nearly 9 months for the case to move through investigation and formal charging. 9 months during which my mother, in a deposition connected to the civil side of the case, was asked directly whether she had any knowledge of her husband creating or filing the fraudulent loan document, and answered, after a long pause the court reporter noted lasted nearly 40 seconds, "No, but I understand now why my mother never trusted him with any of this." That answer, when Daniel relayed it to me afterward, was the moment I understood something had fundamentally shifted in my mother, something Victor clearly hadn't accounted for. Victor was formally charged the following spring with forgery and attempted fraud. The criminal case is still moving through the court system as of the time I'm telling you this, but the civil matter was resolved quickly. The fraudulent lien was voided entirely, the foreclosure filing was permanently dismissed, and the county recorder's office flagged the entire chain of title as protected against any further unauthorized claims. My mother left him almost exactly 4 months after the forensic report came back. She didn't make any dramatic public announcement about it, but she told me, sitting quietly in the back office of the store on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, that learning what he was actually capable of had made her finally understand why her own mother had spent years quietly building walls around the one thing she couldn't bear to lose. "I spent 30 years watching my mother build something real and lasting," she told me, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in years, "and I nearly let myself believe the man standing next to me had our family's best interests at heart. I don't want to be someone who makes that mistake again, Claire. I really don't." Before I tell you where things stand today, I want to ask you something. My grandmother spent years quietly preparing to protect something she loved, long before she ever knew exactly how it would be threatened. Has anyone in your life ever done something like that for you, something you didn't fully understand or appreciate until much later? I'd genuinely love to know. Type it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I think stories like that deserve to be told just as much as this one does. It's been 4 years now since the fraud was uncovered. Ashcroft Books is still standing proudly on its corner. Thursday poetry nights still happen without fail. The free reading corner is still fully stocked, now partly because my mother comes in most Saturday mornings to help restock it herself, coffee in hand. The trust's restriction period ends in 3 more years, and when it finally does, the store will simply keep existing exactly as it always has. Because that was always the real point of the whole arrangement. Never some elaborate punishment or scheme. Just one stubborn, deliberate old woman making absolutely certain that the thing she spent her whole life building would survive long enough for someone who genuinely loved it to keep it standing after she was gone. If you're wondering whether I regret any part of it, standing my ground for years, the 9-month investigation, watching my mother's marriage quietly come apart in the middle of all of it, the honest answer is no. Not for a single day. My only real regret is that my grandmother isn't here to see that the protections she built, the ones Victor once called a trap, worked exactly, precisely the way she always intended them to. Not to punish anyone in advance. Just to protect one small, stubborn, cinnamon-scented corner of the world, long enough for it to matter deeply to someone else too. If this story hit close to home, let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and I love hearing which part of these stories you connected with most. If you enjoyed this one, hitting that like button genuinely helps this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear stories like this. And if you want more stories about family, betrayal, and women finding their strength, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because a new story goes up every single day and you will not want to miss the next one. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. Take care of yourself. You deserve exactly that.